First of all, so as not to waste anyone's time, let me clarify that the subject of this video is not Toledo, Ohio, but rather Toledo in Spain. Actually, and it's pretty weird, even though Toledo, Ohio apparently did not take its name from the city in Spain, the cities have had a mutual sister relationship starting in 1931. And they participate in mutual exchange programs. Here, for example, is a mural of carved ceramic tiles that was unveiled in 1990 and is located in a seafood restaurant in Toledo, Ohio. You've probably figured out that the Toledo that we are in is on the left. Well, I'm on the bus from the train station into the center of historic Toledo. It's a madhouse here. Well, I just checked into the Hostel Central in Toledo, and this is the room. Oh, it's hot in here. Ooh. Huh. I hope they have air conditioning. The good thing is it is right around the corner from the Plaza de Zoco de Vor, which is right over there. That's my hotel, and as you see, it overlooks the Plaza de Zoco de Vor, which is where I'm standing. This place makes Madrid feel like an ice box. And this government building, you see the sign says restored 1945. And that keyhole arch is an example of the Muslim Moorish architecture, the keyhole arch. Going down the stairs through the arch. Behind me is the writer Cervantes. Cervantes' wife came from near Toledo, and he himself knew the city well. This Renaissance building from the 1500s was originally a hospital, but in the 1800s it was converted to a museum and is now the Museum of Santa Cruz. The ornate artwork at the portal is an example of plateresque Spanish Renaissance style. Felipe II was the son of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V, and it was during his reign that Spain achieved its greatest power, extent, and influence. After seeing the archaeological museum yesterday, it really underscores how mashugana all this religious stuff is. Now let's take a look at the famous El Greco paintings here. El Greco was born on the island of Crete, but moved to Toledo in 1577, where he spent the remaining 37 years of his life. The Immaculate Conception, completed 1 year before El Greco's death, shows his subjugation of realistic details for a visionary depiction of spiritual ecstasy. The name El Greco, or the Greek, would have been much easier to pronounce than his real name, Domenikos Theotokopoulos, as he assigned this painting. In this painting of the Holy Family, for some reason, El Greco has depicted Joseph with early onset male pattern baldness. Here we see San Ildefonso, an early saint and bishop, meditating on the Bible. We're in the cloister. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, the two Toledos consider themselves sister cities, and in 1971 participated in a cultural exchange. Toledo, Spain, named this street Calle de Toledo de Ohio, and in reciprocation, the city of Toledo, Ohio, created a park named after Toledo, Spain. The Calle del Comercio is the main pedestrian drag that leads from the Plaza de Zocadavir to the cathedral. In the Middle Ages, Toledo was renowned for having the best steel, and if you had a Toledo steel sword, it was a status symbol. The City Hall flies 4 flags: the EU, Spain, the region of Castilla-La Mancha, and the city of Toledo. The building was originally constructed in 1575, but modified by many architects over the centuries. Here is where the early Visigoth Christians built a church, which was replaced by a great mosque by the Islamic Moors in the 700s, which again was replaced by the Christians starting in the 1200s to become the Toledo Cathedral, the greatest cathedral in Spain. The original design called for a matching tower on the right, but the ground there proved too weak to support one. The main facade has 3 portals. Over the central one, the 12 apostles are at the Last Supper, and below we see Jesus in the mullion and the apostles on the jambs. The carving above the door illustrates the Virgin Mary bestowing a holy vestment on the local bishop Ildefonso, thus making Toledo the leading Christian city in Spain. The cathedral is an example of pure Gothic style, but it does have some unusual features. It has 5 aisles in the nave instead of the usual 3, probably to keep on the footprint of the earlier mosque that was there. It has a crisscross ceiling, massive columns, and 500-year-old stained glass windows. The walled enclosure in the middle of the nave is the choir. Looking through the iron grille into the high altar, one can study a masterpiece of Gothic art. It was completed in 1504 and took about 27 artists to do this. It is 5 stories high and depicts various scenes from the birth of Christ to his crucifixion. The carvings are of wood and gilded with real gold. From the top going down is the crucifixion, then the Assumption of Mary, then the Nativity, below that a tabernacle and monstrance, and below that a seated Virgin and Child. In front of the main altar is the choir, and this one is considered the most beautiful choir of all European cathedrals. As we enter, we are greeted by the 700-year-old statue of the Virgin and Child. Lining the walls are 120 carved wood stalls, which could accommodate the cathedral clergy. The carvings on the lower stalls depict the finale of the Reconquista, mainly the taking of Granada. The alabaster statues above the columns depict the genealogy of Christ, starting with Adam and Eve and culminating with Joseph and Mary. The throne of the Archbishop features this alabaster relief showing Mary descending from heaven to give Sant Ildefonso his holy robe, thus legitimizing Toledo as a spiritual and hence political capital of Spain. The magnificent walnut carvings of the final stage of the Reconquista and the taking of Granada from the Moors was done by the German artist Rodrigo Alemán. And in the lower section of the stalls, the so-called misericords, are more carvings of a secular nature. The treasury houses this monstrance, which provides another example of what the Spaniards did with all that gold they brought back from the Americas. The monstrance is 430 pounds of gold and silver and has 250 individual statues. It was created in 1517 and is still used to hold the Holy Communion wafer, which is paraded on a float every year through the city. Behind the high altar is the so-called transparente, whereby a hole was cut in the ceiling in the 1700s to allow the light of God to illuminate a altarpiece, which is a masterpiece of Baroque art. This Baroque explosion of figures is in contrast to the Gothic style of the rest of the cathedral. In addition to the skylight in the ceiling, another hole was cut. It looks like beams of light radiating from the center that penetrates into the high altar and thus allows the tabernacle of the high altar to be illuminated like a spotlight. Hence the name Transparente. And at the bottom we see Mary holding the baby Jesus. And at the very bottom we see two cherubs who are supporting the entire assembly. This masterpiece was designed and executed by the Italian Narciso Tome and his four sons. Clearly, artistic genius ran in this family. This room, the chapter house, is where meetings of the governing body of the cathedral are celebrated. The fresco on the front wall shows on the left Jesus being taken off the cross, in the center a Pietà, and on the right a resurrection. The opposing wall depicts the Last Judgment, with the 7 sins being shown from left to right: arrogance, avarice, the guy with the coins; lust, the woman; anger, the one shouting at lust; gluttony, the fat guy; envy, and laziness. Encircling the room are 2 rows of portraits of Toledo archbishops going back to the 16th century. In the sacristy, this ceiling shows Mary descending to earth, she's in blue, to give the priestly robe to San Ildefonso. This painting was by Giordano. The sacristy also has 19 paintings by El Greco and other masterworks by Francisco de Goya, Titian, Velázquez, Caravaggio, and Bellini. The crown jewel of this collection is El Greco's Disrobing of Christ. The cloister was built next to the cathedral in the early 1400s and was built over the site of an old Jewish market. Passing over the Tagus River, or in Spanish, Rio Tajo, we see in the distance the Alcantara Bridge. The Alcantara Bridge was built by the Romans after they founded the city of Toledo, though there have been subsequent reconstructions. The city of Toledo has a population of about 82,000 people, most of whom live outside of the old walled city, which is surrounded by the Tajo River on three sides. I was told that those who do live in the old city are mostly shopkeepers or people providing essential services. Most of the younger people would be living in the outer suburbs. In 1986, Toledo was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and as such, any architectural renovations must comply with strict regulations. The Alcazar Fortress towers over the city, and then we see the cathedral. Below that, a seminary for ecclesiastical studies, which in the early 1900s would receive students from all over Spain. And at the western end, the Monastery of San Juan de los Reyes. The San Martin Bridge was built in the late 1300s to give western access to the city. At the time, it was one of the longest bridges in the world. It has two fortified towers. Crossing back across the river, one gets another view of that bridge. The Bisagra Gate was built by the Moors in the 10th century. Notice the little slits above the door for arrows and the keyhole arches. In 1085, King Alfonso VI, also known as Alfonso the Brave or Alfonso el Bravo, laid siege to the city and conquered it and entered through that gate. This was a significant conquest because Toledo was a cultural and spiritual center of the peninsula, but had been occupied by the Moors since the early 700s. This northern part of the city was not protected by the Tajo River, and hence a series of gates had been erected to limit access. The Puerta del Sol, or Gate of the Sun, dates from the late 1300s. The medallion above the arch depicts the ordination of the Visigothic Ildefonsus, the patron saint of Toledo. And just before 10 o'clock at night, we arrive back in the Plaza de Zocodover. Well, it's Friday in Toledo, and starting the afternoon with some sightseeing. This is the Convent of Santa Ursula from the 13th century. There used to be nuns here that made marzipan, but they moved out. And this is Mudéjar architecture with the keyhole arches, which were Muslim craftsmen who had now working for the Christian bosses. This cafe sells marzipan made by nuns from local monasteries. And there's even a display here. Legend has it that in the 12th century, when the city was besieged by Arabs and people were starving, nuns came up with the idea of mashing almonds and sugar together to create marzipan. But the truth seems to be that the Arabs imported these sweets when they invaded the peninsula in the 8th century. This is the tomb of Count Don Gonzalo Ruiz of Orgaz, a mayor of Toledo who died in 1323. And in this chapel, in the church of Santo Tome, is one of El Greco's most famous paintings, done in 1586. It depicts the legend in which two saints descend from heaven to bury the Count. As the two saints lower the deceased into the tomb, his soul, represented by a baby in the arms of the angel in the yellow vestment, ascends almost through looks like a spiritual birth canal to be greeted by Mary. In contrast to the spiritual realm above, the earthly realm below is painted in realistic detail with actual portraits of local nobles, El Greco's son in the lower left, realistic foreshortening of the deceased in his shiny armor being lowered into the grave, and in fact, one figure stares out at us from the back, and that's El Greco himself. And this is the Transito Synagogue in Toledo, built in 1361 for the Jews, constructed by Muslim craftsmen with approval of the Christian community. I suppose this is what you call Mudehar style, since it has some of the architectural elements of the Muslim world, such as those keyhole arches. Let's go inside. The synagogue is located in the heart of the old medieval Jewish quarter and was built by Samuel Halavi, whose family had served the Castilian kings for generations. It was intended originally as a private house of worship and as a yeshiva school. In the great hall here, the men worshipped on the ground floor facing east toward the Torah, and the women would have occupied the balconies on the second floor. Most of the intricate stucco carving is the original and depicts leaves and vines and flowers, no human shapes, which were prohibited by the Torah and by the Quran. The Torah was housed in that niche with the three arches. This synagogue is unique in that the interior is decorated in Muslim style, or Mudehar style. The Mudehars were those Muslims who stayed in Spain after the Reconquista and remained under Christian rule. This patch of floor has been preserved because after the Jews were expelled from Spain, the synagogue was converted to a church and the altar table sat there. The crenellated arches and the intricate polychrome stucco work is characteristic of Mudehar art. In the 1900s, this building was transformed into the Sephardi Museum and has an exhibit on the history of Toledo's Jews, as well as this exhibit of various objects that are part of Jewish customs and traditions. Well, that's enough for that Transito Synagogue. Boy, it's hard to learn everything in a museum. It's like reading and studying a book. I'm outside the synagogue, looking out across the Tahoe River. And now we're in the Synagogue of Santa Maria la Blanca. What a name for a synagogue. Actually, it was originally called the Ibn Shushan Synagogue before it was later converted to a church, and it is considered the oldest intact synagogue building in Europe. Here we have another example of mudéjar construction with columns supporting horseshoe arches, a coiffured ceiling. There is no women's gallery, as there should be in a synagogue. The synagogue was built by Muslim craftsmen around 1200, but was never used as a mosque. And then in 1391, when the Jews were first expelled from Toledo, it became a church. It eventually fell into ruin in later centuries and has been restored with its 5 naves, the pillars, which have these vegetal capitals on top of them, and the whitewashed walls. It doesn't feel like a synagogue, does it? There are all these winding, narrow lanes. Town's impossible to navigate, and rather difficult with somebody with a heart condition. But anyway, I'm standing here outside the Monastery of de los Reyes complex. This is the church. Notice the chains on the walls. These were the manacles and the shackles worn by Christian prisoners in Granada. And per order of Queen Isabel, when Granada fell and the Moors were defeated, these shackles were festooned on the walls of the monastery. I've entered the cloister. Every female saint is holding a book. This 15th century Franciscan monastery and church was founded in the heart of the Jewish quarter by the Catholic monarchs Isabel and Fernando to demonstrate the supremacy of their faith. Originally, they wanted to be buried here, but it ended up that they were buried in Granada, which was their prize conquest. Toledo was chosen as the site for this monastery because of its central geographic location and because it had been the capital of the ancient Visigoth kingdom. The church has a single nave covered with ribbed vaults, lateral chapels between the buttresses, and a star-shaped dome over the presbytery. In the 19th century, after church lands were sold, the friars were expelled. But in modern times, the Franciscan community has come back and is active at this time. The upper cloisters were first completed in 1526 and restored in the 19th century. There are lots of gargoyles to see, and there's also mudéjar ornamentation such as this ceiling. The 2 lions represent the kingdom of Leon, and the castle in the middle represents the kingdom of Castile. The marriage of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabel of Castile paved the way for the unification of those 2 regions and the creation of Spain as we know it once the Moors were driven out. We are back down in the lower cloisters. And over here, amidst all the carvings, is one which expresses what a disgruntled stonemason really felt about these Franciscan monks. A monkey in a monk's habit reading a Bible upside down while he sits on the toilet. Travesía del Judío, or Passageway of the Jew, in the Jewish quarter of Toledo. There's a little problem here. I boarded this bus, which makes a circular loop around the city, just to stay on it and see it. So the bus has stopped at the end of the line, and the driver probably didn't see me, and he stepped out, and it is sweltering in here, and now the door is locked, and I can't get out, so I hope it's not going to be too long. Well, the bus driver finally came back, and I was starting to worry that that bus was going to be my coffin, and you can imagine it was hot in there, but he was very sorry that I was in there, and anyway, it all ended up all right. I'm back in the main square, Circle de Verre. The Museum of the Army is one of Europe's top military museums. The collection was moved from Madrid to the Alcazar Fortress in 2010, which is where we are now. I'm at the Alcazar Castle, which, believe it or not, was totally demolished during the Spanish Civil War and carefully restored, like so many other sites I see here in Europe. Now it's an army museum. Woo, sorry for that background wind noise. Across the river, this medieval castle now houses a 2-star hotel. Coming into view is the Infantry Academy. The building from the late 1940s is in a neo-Renaissance style. It's enormous, but it harmonizes well with the Alcazar. That's the statue of Carlos V in his courtyard here in the Alcazar Army Museum. And again, I think it was rebuilt. Today is a much, much nicer day to be outside. It's very overcast, and I think it's supposed to rain. And that's the Alcazar, different side of it behind me. And I think you can see where the original stone is and where the renovated newer block is. This is a military parade for Queen Elizabeth II. All these miniature toy soldiers. This is what the Alcazar looked like after the siege of 1936 with air raids and bombing. Oh, and there's the courtyard we were in. Well, leaving Toledo, or at least I'm walking toward the train station, going down all these escalators, which takes you down below. All right, I've walked from way up there, using the escalators, of course, and I'm almost at the train station, heading back down to Madrid. All right, I've just about arrived at the train station. I'm going to say goodbye to Toledo. So I've arrived finally at this train station with its Moorish design. So I caught a train to Madrid for a one-night layover before heading to Segovia, the last destination of this trip.